Good morning. It is Friday, February 8th, 2019, and you're watching live coverage of the departure of the Northrop Grumman Cygnus resupply craft from the International Space Station. I'm Leah Cheshire in Mission Control at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Leading today's teams on the ground is Flight Director Anthony Varia. He's in constant contact with all of the flight controllers here, currently conducting a go, no-go poll for a release of Cygnus at 10:15 this morning. To his right is Capcom Lara Beachy, or Capsule Communicator, meaning she is speaking with the crew on board the International Space Station and relaying commands from the ground. Today's Visiting Vehicle Officer, or VVO, is Thomas Castleberry, who is also in contact with the Northrop Grumman Flight Control Team in Dulles, Virginia. Today, the Northrop Grumman team is led by Mission Director Paul Brower. Their team in Virginia is also keeping tabs on the Cygnus vehicle and will take over full control of the spacecraft after joint operations end when Cygnus crosses the approach ellipsoid, which is an invisible line around the space station about a kilometer away that is monitored by flight controllers. Cygnus has been docked to the Earth-facing side of the International Space Station's Unity module for 81 days after its arrival in November 2018. Earlier today, flight controllers unbolted Cygnus from the Unity module and used the space station's Canadarm2, which you see in the picture here, to maneuver it into the position you see now, almost ready for release. Once declared ready for release, controls of the Canadarm2 will be handed over to the astronauts aboard the space station. Currently on board the International Space Station are NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Canadian Space Agency astronaut David Saint-Jacques. Russian cosmonaut and commander of the station is Oleg Kononenko. This crew arrived at the space station on December 3rd, 2018. They are scheduled to remain on board until their return to Earth in June this year. This is the first space flight for McClain and Saint-Jacques, who are currently in the cupola with an excellent view of the Canadarm2 and Cygnus, and is currently scheduled for release at 10:15 a.m. Central Time. This is a good view of the cupola and the Cuckoo workstation, where McClain and Saint-Jacques will monitor the departure of Cygnus this morning. Flight controllers on the ground just finished conducting a go, no-go poll for Cygnus release this morning, confirming that Cygnus is ready for that on-time departure, just about 5 minutes after at 16:15 or 10:15 a.m. Central Time. Controls of the Canadarm2 have now been handed over to the crew. Over the next several minutes, McClain and Saint-Jacques will use the station's Canadarm2, the robotic arm you see, to release Cygnus after it has been unbolted from the Earth-facing port of the Unity module, and it is currently maneuvered into the release position. All of that was conducted by ground controllers this morning. McClain and Saint-Jacques are positioned in the cupola. They practiced this release to prepare for today's departure.
We're targeting a release time of 16:15. And I can also give you a go in step 1 of 1.602, the Cygnus departure monitoring procedure, to check the Cygnus configurations.
The times, copy target time of 16:15, and again, our briefing is complete, and we'll put step one in work.
And just a FYI, the 16:15 release time is just so we can get around some Radicom.
And Houston, say again to get around what?
Some Radicom.
Copy, understand, okay.
Cygnus is currently 262 statute miles above the Earth, still attached to the Canadarm on the International Space Station. The space station is flying in an orbital nighttime off the southern coast of Australia. Here you can see McLean and St. Jacques inside that cupola workstation, and just above their heads through that cupola window, you can see Cygnus still attached to the Canadarm2, and they are preparing for its departure.
Houston, station for Cygnus.
Go ahead.
In step one, the Cygnus configuration checks are complete. Crew is ready for release and departure.
We copy. Stand by for release.
That was NASA astronaut Anne McLean confirming that the crew has completed all of their steps and are ready for release at 10:15 Central Time this morning. The crew on board closed the hatch to the Cygnus spacecraft on Wednesday, February 6th, and installed a slingshot CubeSat deployer on Thursday the 7th. Today, Cygnus is taking home 5,500 pounds of trash items. After Cygnus departs from the space station today, it will carry out an extended mission over a little more than 2 weeks. Just prior to the departure, we mentioned the slingshot deployer hardware was installed on Cygnus. The spacecraft will maneuver into a higher altitude, about 50 to 100 kilometers above the space station, where the slingshot satellite deployer will release its 2 CubeSats into orbit. Cygnus will then later move to a lower orbit of 325 kilometers. They'll deploy an additional CubeSat called KickSat-2. It carries 100 tiny satellites called femtosatellites or chipsats. By maneuvering Cygnus above and below the space station to deploy these satellites, teams are able to mitigate debris concerns. After satellite deployment, Cygnus will remain in orbit and is scheduled to deorbit and burn up in the Earth's atmosphere harmlessly over the Pacific Ocean on February 25th. Each of these Cygnus spacecraft are named after influential individuals in the world of spaceflight. The spacecraft you see today is dedicated to John Young. As a NASA astronaut, Young logged 835 hours in space across 6 different missions. He was a member of NASA's second astronaut class, and he flew on Gemini 3 to test the Gemini spacecraft, as well as Gemini 10. He was the command module pilot on Apollo 10 and 16, meaning he had the opportunity to walk on the moon. He also flew on STS-1, which was the maiden flight of the space shuttle in 1981 with Bob Crippen, and concluded his flights with STS-9. A great view of Anne McClain in the cupola, taking photos of the Cygnus resupply craft. In front of Anne, you can see that cuckoo workstation where she and David St. Jacques will command the release of the Cygnus resupply craft later. Canadian Space Agency astronaut David St. Jacques has joined Anne McClain in the cupola. As she continues to take pictures, he brings up some of the shutters of the cupola windows. We are monitoring Twitter this morning. You can submit your questions to be answered on NASA TV with the hashtag AskNASA. First, we have a question from Jolo, who wants to know how close we are to commercial space travel. NASA has a commercial crew program with our partners SpaceX and Boeing. The first test of SpaceX's Crew Dragon is scheduled for March 2nd. This is SpaceX mission DM-1, meaning Demonstration Mission 1. The spacecraft will launch on March 2nd, make its way to the International Space Station, and remain docked. This first mission will not have any crew, and we're hoping to see the first crewed flights of the SpaceX Crew Dragon later this year. NASA's Commercial Crew Program is developing America's next generation spacecraft, which is going to allow us to return humans to the space station from American soil. You can see there's now sunlight outside of the cupola windows, where you've got a great picture of Cygnus, the resupply craft, at the top of your screen. The International Space Station is currently 262 statute miles flying over the South Pacific Ocean.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. We are about 10 minutes out, and we will be go for Cygnus release on time at 16:15. That's steps 2 through 4 in 1.320. And a reminder, the release window closes at 17:19.
We understand. We're standing by for targeting a 16:15 release, steps 2 through 4.
That was Capcom Laura Beachy in communication with the crew on board the International Space Station, confirming that Cygnus will be ready for release at 10:15 a.m. Central Time. The International Space Station satellites are currently handing over from one to another. This is a tracked loss of signal. And right now you've got a great view of the International Space Station Flight Control Room at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where ground controllers are currently monitoring the Cygnus resupply craft and its departure after 81 days on the International Space Station. Cygnus began its journey with a launch at 3:01 a.m. Central Time on November 17, 2018, carrying over 7,000 pounds of cargo to the International Space Station. It launched from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport Pad 0A at NASA's Wallops Flight Facility on Wallops Island. The Cygnus launch was initially postponed from November 15th to the 17th as teams waited on better weather conditions. And with clear skies and temperatures about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, Cygnus began its journey to the space station. This is Northrop Grumman's 10th commercial resupply mission to the International Space Station. And after a 9-minute ascent to orbit, Cygnus later met up with the International Space Station on November 18th when it was captured by NASA astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor. This is a replay of that capture. You've got a view from the Canadarm looking onto the Cygnus resupply craft. NASA astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor was alongside European astronaut Alexander Gerst, the station commander at the time, using the Canadarm2. They were also located in the cupola module, just like Anne McClain and David St. Jacques are today. The cupola provides not only great views of Earth, but also of the resupply craft on the International Space Station. As you can see, communications have been re-established between the International Space Station and the ground, providing us great views of the Cygnus resupply craft as it flies over the South Pacific Ocean. The release window has now been reported as open for the Cygnus resupply craft, still targeting 10:15 a.m. Central Time release. After Cygnus release this morning, it will travel towards the Keep Out sphere, which is an invisible line about 200 meters away from the International Space Station. We will be on air until it crosses the approach ellipsoid, a kilometer away from the space station. These lines help ground controllers keep aware of vehicles coming to and from the International Space Station. Our coverage will end after the Cygnus resupply craft exits the approach ellipsoid, but Cygnus mission isn't over. It will then maneuver to release some satellites under the control of the Northrop Grumman team in Dulles, Virginia. Ground control teams have just conducted one last go, no-go. Cygnus is ready for release. We've got a short 20-second satellite handover. Regaining our views of the Cygnus resupply craft as astronauts Anne McClain and David St. Jacques prepare to release it from the Canadarm2 on the International Space Station. The vehicle has now been unlatched. Snares are open on the Cygnus resupply craft, meaning that it is now detached from the International Space Station at 10:16 a.m. Central Time, just over Peru. got a view from the Canadarm2 of the Cygnus resupply craft, now backing away from the International Space Station. Once again, that was a 10:16 a.m. Central Time detachment over the Pacific Ocean, just west of the coast of Peru. Teams on the ground reporting that everything is looking nominal for the Cygnus departure. Cygnus now 4.5 meters away from the Canadarm2.
Houston, station on 2 from the cupola. Cygnus depart commanded.
Great job, and congratulations to the Northrop Grumman and ISS teams. John Young was a great pioneer of the space frontier, and it was an honor to have SS John Young aboard the ISS.
Indeed, John Young, a very successful predecessor of ours, the only person to fly twice on each of the 3 NASA programs, Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle. SS John Young was also a very successful mission launched from Wallops Island, Virginia, on November 17, 2018, captured 2 days later, docked at the space station for 2 months and 20 days. It arrived with 3,350 kilos of cargo and departed with more than 2.5 tons of trash. Conducted more than 20 experiments, including groundbreaking science to help us understand and treat Parkinson's disease in a new prototype facility for cycling and make our own tools here on orbit. Cygnus will continue supporting education research and the growing space economy even after it departs our orbiting laboratory, deploying several CubeSats and performing investigations after departure for several weeks for commercial and government customers. It's great to see the teamwork between NASA, commercial entities, and so many people and so many countries to make all of this happen.
The departure burn of Cygnus has begun.
Thank you for that. And the Cygnus departure burn is now in progress, so you can continue to monitor departure at steps 2 and 3 in 1.602.
Some great words from Capcom Laura Beachy and then Canadian Space Agency astronaut David St. Jacques. recapping some of Cygnus's mission, including the science that it brought on board the space station. We can still see Cygnus outside of the cupola windows while astronauts continue to monitor its departure. And the departure burn of Cygnus is complete.
Houston Station on 2 from the cupola. Step 2 is complete, and on step 3, Tigo and Vigo are no longer visible.
We copy, thanks.
The vehicle now exiting the keep-out sphere, about 200 meters away from the space station.
Station Houston, Cygnus departure burn is complete. You can safe the SSRMS per step 5 in 1.320.
Copy.
In Station Houston, Cygnus has exited the 200-meter keep-out sphere.
Confirmation from Capcom Lara Beachy to the crew on orbit that Cygnus has exited the keep-out sphere. You can see Anne McClain still taking pictures of Cygnus through the cupola windows. Cygnus getting smaller and smaller as it continues to depart from the International Space Station, heading toward the approach ellipsoid about a kilometer away from the International Space Station. Astronauts are continuing to monitor its departure. Ground teams expecting the Cygnus to exit the approach ellipsoid in about 8 minutes. Cygnus arrived with over 7,000 pounds of cargo, including crew supplies, science investigations, spacewalk equipment, vehicle hardware, and more. And it's leaving today with over 5,500 pounds of trash items. As we mentioned, Cygnus has an extended mission over a little more than 2 weeks. Cygnus will maneuver into a higher altitude to deploy 2 CubeSats into orbit, and then later move to a lower orbit to deploy an additional CubeSat, which carries 100 tiny femtosatellites. Neither of those satellite deployments will be visible on NASA TV, and Cygnus will burn up over the Pacific Ocean, scheduled for February 25th, also not covered on NASA TV. A view here of the cupola with 2 windows looking out on Earth, and the Cuckoo workstation where NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Canadian space astronaut David St. Jacques monitored and released the Cygnus resupply craft at 10:16 a.m. Central Time this morning. Station currently flying 252 statute miles above the Atlantic Ocean, just off the east coast of the United States. This is a view of Mission Control Houston at Johnson Space Center in Texas. Following Cygnus crossing the approach ellipsoid today, teams here will hand over controls to Cygnus and Northrop Grumman Mission Director Paul Brower and his team. Currently experiencing another satellite handover for the International Space Station. Cygnus continues its departure, progressing towards the approach ellipsoid. We've regained communications and video feeds from the International Space Station. Cygnus still approaching the approach ellipsoid within the next few minutes, expecting it to cross that invisible 1-kilometer line around the International Space Station. A view here of the Canadarm2, which was used to maneuver the Cygnus resupply craft today from the Earth-facing side of the Unity module and reposition it into the release position where NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Canadian space astronaut David St. Jacques released the spacecraft. The Cygnus cargo resupply craft SS John Young has exited the approach ellipsoid, meaning joint operations have concluded between Mission Control Houston and Dulles, Virginia Mission Control for Northrop Grumman.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Cygnus has exited the approach ellipsoid.
Station copies, and you'll find a few sets of photos on SSE-8, including a time lapse of the departure.
We copy, thanks, Ann. And hey, we've got a question for you about the PCS in the cupola that you saw the issue on earlier. Was that the PCS that's being relocated, or is it the PCS that's staying in cupola?
It was on the one that was in the cupola, but it also came up on the lab PCS when we attempted to open that one, and so, and it was when we opened the SSRMS page on both of them.
We copy in and understand that the issue is on the lab and cupola PCS that are staying with the RWS.
That is correct, and again, only when we open the SSRMS pages.
We got it, thank you.
Now that Cygnus has crossed the approach ellipsoid, joint operations have concluded between Mission Control Houston and the Northrop Grumman Cygnus Mission Control Team in Dulles, Virginia. This concludes an 81-day stay on the International Space Station for Cygnus. However, its mission is not over. Now that Northrop Grumman mission control teams have control of the vehicle, they will maneuver it to release a series of CubeSats above and below the International Space Station. Cygnus will remain in orbit for the next couple of weeks until February 25th, when it burns up over the Pacific Ocean. The next vehicle scheduled to visit the International Space Station is SpaceX Crew Dragon, their first launch for the Commercial Crew Program of NASA. This will be an uncrewed launch on their DM-1 mission. That's targeted for March 2nd. Once again, Cygnus departed the International Space Station today at 10:16 a.m. Central Time over the west coast of Peru. Thanks for joining our live coverage of the Cygnus departure from the International Space Station. This is Mission Control Houston.